Public comments during a recent Las Cruces City Hall meeting underscored the marked difference in the police presence at two peaceful demonstrations over the weekend. The State Ethics Commission has filed a lawsuit seeking to compel a nonprofit group to disclose its contributors after it spent roughly $56,000 last year in a campaign against changes to New Mexico's medical malpractice laws. A bipartisan bill aimed at combating fentanyl tracking and improving research on copycat drugs is headed to the president's desk for a signature. And a tanker truck was left partially hanging off an Interstate 25 bridge near Cole Avenue in Albuquerque on Monday, following a crash with a tow truck. From the Albuquerque Journal, this is the leading news. I'm Gino Gutierrez. It's Tuesday, June 17th, and I'll have more on those stories in a few moments, plus a look at the weather forecast on the other side of this break.
This episode is brought to you by the Kirtland Partnership Committee. For 30 years, we've been dedicated to supporting, growing, and preserving the Kirtland National Security Complex. We work tirelessly to enhance military readiness, foster community partnerships, improve quality of life, and promote economic development right here in New Mexico. Join us in our mission to ensure that Kirtland remains a cornerstone of national security and a key provider of quality jobs and investment for all of Greater Albuquerque. Together, we can make a powerful impact. Kirtland Partnership Committee, proudly shaping the future of our national security for 30 years.
Public comments during a recent Las Cruces City Hall meeting underscored the marked difference in the police presence at two peaceful demonstrations over the weekend. With more on this story, I'm now joined by the Journal's Southern New Mexico correspondent, Algernon Damasa. Algernon, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Gino.
So, Algernon, as we laid out at the top, there were two different police presences at both of these demonstrations that took place over the weekend. Can you enlighten our listeners a little bit on what those differences were?
Sure. So the protest I think everybody probably knows about was Saturday's No Kings event. These events were taking place in cities all over the United States and New Mexico. Las Cruces had a gathering of up to 3,000 people or so, maybe more, in this particular city park that's near City Hall and across the street from the Las Cruces Police Department headquarters. Now, the night before, on Friday evening, there was a much smaller gathering, about 300 people it's hard to tell because people were coming and going, but a solid couple of hundred people came to that very same park, and they had a demonstration focused mostly on ICE and mass deportations and how they were affecting communities in New Mexico. And it was a very peaceful, festive kind of thing. There were signs, there was music, there was watermelon and chilled bottles of water. There were children present, and so they had activities for the children. And it was a very chill hangout the night before the big demonstration. So both of these events had very different police presences. On Friday night, where the average age of the participants was younger and it was much more directed at ICE specifically, there was no visible police presence. There may have been a plainclothes officer or two, but what people noticed were sharpshooters stationed briefly on the roof of the fire station and definitely on the roof of the police department, as well as on the balcony over the entrance to the public library, which is adjacent to the park. And that was it. There was no communication. They didn't know what was going on. They just saw these sharpshooters with their rifles pointed in the general direction of that corner of the park where the protest was happening. And some people left. They did not feel comfortable. Some people were angry. They felt it was ironic that they were there talking about overreach and over-policing of brown people in the United States, and they were met with police officers who had rifles on stocks and were kind of citing the range. Saturday was a very different atmosphere. There weren't a lot of police officers present, but there were some bicycle officers present. They even helped out when somebody fell in what appeared to be a heat-related event and rendered some first aid to that person. And just generally were hanging out and talking to people, and it was a very different vibe. So on Monday, there was a city council meeting where for more than an hour, people questioned the chief of police and the city council about why these two gatherings, which happened within 12 hours of each other, were approached so differently.
And Algernon, I'm curious, as I'm sure our listeners are as well, what was the police department's reasoning for having such different tactics at these two demonstrations?
Essentially, it comes down to two things. The chief of police said, number one, they had intercepted social media threats in the form of posts and comments, some of which I've seen that were made available to me, that threatened direct wishes for harm or even maybe a half joking intent to commit violence on these protests. And some of that, maybe most of that, would have been directed toward the No Kings protest, which had a lot more publicity, but could also have applied to the Friday night gathering as well. And so there was that. And so the chief said, look, if we hadn't been there and been prepared for something and something had happened, we'd be having a whole different conversation about why we didn't prepare. The second thing he suggested was that the No Kings protest, which was a much bigger event, had a permit, and so they had a point of contact, and they were able to communicate about potential threats, whereas the more spontaneous gathering, they didn't have a permit, they didn't know who to talk to. I'm not sure that really satisfied people's concerns because the police department is right across the street. And it's hard to imagine how, in the time it took to set up 2 or 3 sharpshooters, someone couldn't have strolled over and said, hey, who's in charge here? We just want to tell you what we're doing.
And Algernon, that leads me into my next question. What was the public response to the answers that law enforcement gave?
Yeah, there was a range of reactions. I mean, some people who are very suspicious of police anyway, federal or local, felt like this was a directed effort to intimidate protesters based on the content. The chief denied that. Some people thought that maybe it had to do with age. The No Kings organizers and the average age of the people participating in that was older, a lot more sort of older, white-haired, white-skinned people associated with that. Some people wondered if it could have had to do with whiteness and or age, as opposed to the younger and browner mix of faces ICE action on Friday.
So, Algernon, we know the answers that law enforcement gave. We know the reaction from the community. Are there any next steps that'll be taken here?
In the realm of action, City Councilor Johanna Bencomo and some of the other members of the council suggested that a good way to move forward would be to look at general orders pertaining to protests, sort of a general policy for how the police manage their presence and interact with people at events like this. And that might be a way that this conversation turns into some policy down the road.
So definitely a fascinating situation taking place down in Las Cruces over the weekend. Algernon, thank you so much for sharing the latest with us.
Anytime, Gino.
The State Ethics Commission has filed a lawsuit seeking to compel a nonprofit group to disclose its contributors after it spent roughly $56,000 last year in a campaign against changes to New Mexico's medical malpractice laws. With more on this development, we now turn to the Journal's Capitol Bureau Chief, Dan Boyd. Dan, thank you so much for joining me. Anytime we utter the words medical malpractice, I'm sure ears across New Mexico perk up. This has been a hot button issue for several years, something the New Mexico legislature has been trying to solve. But as far as this lawsuit goes and the part this nonprofit group plays in it, what can you share with us?
Yeah, so this has been, obviously, as you mentioned, medical malpractice has been a real hot button issue the last few years. I mean, there's been a lot of debate over kind of the lack of healthcare providers in New Mexico and what exactly is the reason for that. And more specifically, how big of a role does the medical malpractice laws play in that healthcare provider shortage? So kind of given that background, this group called New Mexico Safety Over Profits kind of hadn't, heard much from them. They kind of emerged last fall a little bit. They put out a report. They've been active, but they say that as a 501c4, a nonprofit group, that they're not required to disclose their donors or exactly how they spend their money. So that was kind of brought up in a story earlier this year that Searchlight New Mexico did. Now the State Ethics Commission has escalated this, taken a step farther, filed a lawsuit today and said, they said in their lawsuit and in the press release that under state lobbying laws, if you engage in this type of political behavior, you have to file with the Secretary of State's office and you have to reveal your donors. So this isn't the first time that there's been this kind of a dispute, involving groups and whether or not to have to disclose that information. But it comes at a particularly interesting time, given their connection to this medical malpractice issue.
And Dan, you touched on an interesting part of this story, how nonprofit groups typically don't have to share this type of information, but because the State Ethics Commission is saying they engage in political behavior, that's really the foundation of this lawsuit, right?
Yeah, I think that they cited in their lawsuit, some of the state's lobbying laws, which say that if you do engage in this type of political behavior, if you try to sway people's views, or if you try to encourage them to vote for certain candidates, those kind of things. By nature of you doing that, you have kind of become a political entity, or you become basically a political committee or a PAC, under state laws. And if you are a PAC, then there are certain requirements you have to follow. You have to file with Secretary of State's office. You have to provide these periodic reports. And, most importantly, you have to say where you're getting your money from. So there can be kind of a fine line there about what's educational, which nonprofits are allowed to do, and what kind of crosses the line into, political behavior and political action. And I think that's what this case is going to kind of come down to.
And Dan, one of the more fascinating parts of this story was the political connections that some of these people that were a part of this nonprofit have with current political figures here in New Mexico.
Yeah, so this group, the New Mexico Safety Over Profits, interestingly, it doesn't really have a full-time staff, but its executive director, the person who did release a statement today in response to this lawsuit, is John Lipschutz, who's been kind of fairly well-known political figure at the Roundhouse and is currently the campaign manager for Sam Bregman, obviously, who's one of the leading contenders, the Democratic governor contenders in next year's gubernatorial race. So interesting connection there. I don't think the Bregman campaign itself has any direct role in this lawsuit, but the fact that the campaign manager also representing this outside group could be interesting to see how that kind of develops going forward.
Yeah, there's just so many layers to this story, Dan, and this lawsuit just filed, so it'll be interesting to see how it develops as the months roll on. Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Dan Boyd joining us to share the latest. Thank you so much, Dan.
Hey, you bet. Thanks for having me.
In other headlines from the newsroom, a bipartisan bill aimed at combating fentanyl tracking and improving research on copycat drugs is headed to President Donald Trump's desk. The Halt Fentanyl Act, which was co-sponsored by Senator Martin Heinrich, a Democrat from New Mexico, and Republicans Bill Cassidy and Chuck Grassley, would permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs, closing a loophole that traffickers have used to tweak chemical formulas and evade prosecution. The bill establishes mandatory minimum sentences, 5 years for 10 grams and 10 years for 100 grams of substances without medical use, while allowing up to life sentences for high-volume offenses. It also streamlines the research process for scientists studying these substances. Supporters, including New Mexico law enforcement, say it's critical for curbing fentanyl-related deaths, which accounted for 65% of New Mexico's 948 overdose deaths in 2023. However, critics warn the bill may be too broad and risks reviving failed drug war policies. New Mexico's congressional delegation was split on the bill, and a trailer truck was left partially hanging off an Interstate 25 bridge near Cole Avenue in Albuquerque Monday afternoon following a crash with a tow truck. No injuries were reported according to fire and police officials. Emergency crews responded around 2 p.m., finding the tanker blocking traffic and teetering off the edge of the bridge. Fortunately, the tanker's fuel tank was empty, eliminating any hazardous spill risks. The cause of the crash remains unclear, and an investigation is underway. Authorities confirm no structural damage to the bridge, though the Jersey barrier sustained some impact. Heavy equipment and multiple wreckers were used to stabilize and separate the vehicles. The leading news is powered by the journalism of the Albuquerque Journal. If you enjoy hearing all of the stories we share with you here daily, please consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Journal by utilizing our discount code in the show notes. Each subscription helps support local journalism and allows us to provide you with the news that matters to you. Now, taking a look at the weather forecast for Albuquerque, today you can expect sunny skies with a high near 98, and as for this evening, clear skies are expected with a low around 62. To keep up with all the latest news from the Albuquerque Journal, you can visit our website at abqjournal.com. That's the leading news. I'm Gino Gutierrez. We'll be back tomorrow.